Okay. We're going to do it today. We're going to finish the Torah service today. I think I've been saying that for 3 weeks. I feel confident about that. We're on page 154 in Siddur Sim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals. Last week, we recessed the Torah around the sanctuary while singing Psalm 29, and we kind of went into detail about Psalm 29. So after the recessional is complete, we are now back at the ark and ready to replace the Torah scroll into the ark. All right. Oh, I didn't want to do that. So we start with the words Uvnucho Yomar, Shuva Adonai, Revavot Alfei Yisrael. I didn't want to. Let's put it all down. Okay, that's better. So as we can see, and with its resting, he would say, Adonai, return to the myriad families of Israel. Adonai, rise up to your resting place, you and your mighty ark. May your priests wear righteousness and your faithful rejoice. For the sake of David, your servant, do not reject your anointed one. For I have given you good instruction. Do not abandon my Torah. It is a tree of life to those who cling to it, and its supporters are happy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and in all its paths are peace. Adonai, return us to you that we might renew our days as of old. So we have a smattering of verses and a few lines that are not biblical verses kind of placed there in the middle. Themes, what themes do we see?
Turning to a resting place.
Okay, we've got coming to a resting place.
Notion of returning, renewing
with that
by
word
returning.
Shuva right here. Right. Pointer. This word Shuva, return, and then at the very end we have it again, Hashivenu, which is return us. Venashuva, so that we may return.
Yeah. Renew our days as of old. What does that really mean?
So Chadesh Yamenu Kekedem. So Chadesh, like Chadash, like new. So here it's a verb. Make new again. Yamenu, our days. Kekedem, as before. Right, as in days of old, right? So, and this is the comes at the I think it's the second to last verse of Megillat Eicha, of the scroll of Lamentations, which of course is it's a lament. It's describing the horrors of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. This is the first destruction, but it ends on a hopeful note, and this is the line. And so that becomes the final line of our Torah service. Yeah, other themes stand out?
Continue to be with us. Do not reject. Do not abandon. Faithful.
Okay.
Then there's also the tree of life, cling to it, supporters are happy, then its ways are ways of pleasantness, paths of peace.
Right, so we've got through these 3 verses from Proverbs, all of which are describing, well, we've got a lekach tov, a good thing, a good possession, a Torah, Eitz Chaim Hi, it is a tree of life. So what is the it here?
Torah.
Presumably Torah. Deracheha, its paths are paths of peace, pleasantness. Kol nativoteha, all of its ways are of peace. So we've got lots of its and we, all right, so in the context of Proverbs actually is not talking about Torah as the scroll that we know it. When the word Torah appears, and this is consistent with a lot of wisdom literature, Torah means instruction. And you find a number of words that are used to describe kind of the same, really the same concept. So it's instruction or chokhmah, wisdom. We see that a lot, or lekach tov, like it's a good possession. Here it's translated as instruction. Imrati, my sayings. Lots of different words appear in Proverbs that are, it's about wisdom in kind of the grandest sense. And probably in an original context, wisdom is something that a person acquires through life experience and through kind of contemplation of those experiences. But what the tradition has now equated Torah with chokhmah. And so Torah, I guess, in its most expansive sense. And the idea that all truth is contained within Torah, within the 5 books of Moses, if only we can read it correctly. So
I like the phrase that it's ways of pleasantness, which is not generally what you think of with any of the topics, whether it's the history of our people, the Torah, any of it.
But if we're saying Torah, if we read it the right way, that the Torah is a guide to life, this is going to tell us how to live the good life, or the best possible life, then So, but anyway, so what we've done here at the end of our Torah service and putting the Torah away is we've brought in these 3 verses that are all kind of expressing proclaiming the praises of Torah. And that makes sense, right? That we would be praising Torah as God's word as we're about to put it away in the ark and close the doors. All right, let's take a look at the next passage. Okay, we saw this text at the beginning of the Torah service. All right, so this is from Numbers, chapter 10. And so this is describing the Israelites' wanderings in the wilderness, and that they would kind of have the pillar of fire and cloud guiding them and telling them where they needed to stop. And so this is the passage. They marched from the mountain of the Lord a distance of 3 days. The ark of the covenant of the Lord traveled in front of them on that 3 days journey to seek out a resting place for them. And the Lord's cloud kept above them by day as they moved on from camp. All right, so we've got the Israelites, the ark is out in front, being kind of carried, and the pillar is kind of right above that, and it's indicating when they need to walk and when they need to stop. And the what's in the ark?
The tablets,
right.
and is the original, the scroll that was transcribed by Moses.
Well, not according to the Torah doesn't mention anything about a scroll, right?
Well, but our tradition does.
Right, but the Torah has a placing it the broken and the second set of tablets of the covenant are placed inside the ark. Later on, they would place a jar of manna to have a remembrance of it, and then the Nehushtan, which is the serpent staff that Moses is going to make a bit later on in their journeys. That's going to eventually be deposited inside the ark. But more importantly, the ark is God's footstool, right? So God's presence rests above the ark inside the Holy of Holies, or inside the tent of meeting when Moses is convening with God. So this ark is very, very important, very powerful. It's providing guidance and protection for them. And then notice we get to the upside nuns, a nun and another upside nun.
Oh.
And this is, it appears that way in the Torah scroll. This is said to be an entire book of the Torah in and of itself, just 2 verses long. So if you want to know how many books are in the 5 books of Moses, the answer is 7. Vayhi binsoa ha'aron vayomer Moshe kuma Adonai v'yafutzu ovecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. That should sound familiar, right? That's how we opened the Torah service. When the ark was to set out, Moses would say, "Advance, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered and may your foes flee before you." All right, that was very, very nice. But now the Torah is coming to the ark, I should say, is coming to a stop. They're about to set up camp. Uvnucho yomar, when it would halt or when it would come to rest. He would say, Shuva Adonai Rivavot Alfei Yisrael. Return, O Lord, you who are Israel's myriads of thousands. All right, so that's I don't know what that means, but it's kind of but we have let's see, Shuva Adonai, return, O Lord, Rivavot Alfei. A rivava is a myriad, which is 10,000. So Rivavot Alfei Yisrael, 10,000 of thousands of Israel. So something like that. Probably a reference to when we talk about the Lord of hosts. These are the hosts, right? So God, with all of God's angelic court, are going out in front of the people to wage war against Israel's enemies and offer divine protection. And so when we stop marching, we want to make sure that God's going to come back when it's time to march again. And so Moses would say this, return, O Lord, with your myriads of thousands of angelic warriors for us. Okay, so that's in its context in Numbers, or I should say in the book that is the extra book that is placed in the middle of Numbers. But of course, we have translated the idea of the ark from this footstool of God into the cabinet that contains the Torah scroll that is in our sanctuaries. And so now when we include this in our Torah service, right here, it doesn't mean this, golden box that the Israelites were carrying. We're actually talking about the ark that's in front of the sanctuary, right? And so we're saying, as we noted, this final paragraph starts with return and ends with return, right? So what are we at? We're saying, God, come back to us. Let the Torah come back to us. We're going to come back to you, right? So we put the Torah in the ark. We recite all of these verses to accompany it. And then at the very end, we say, return us to you, right? Give us another opportunity to come back, to open up the ark, take the Torah out and read from it again. And we also saw the tradition that the Torah is we're not supposed to have 3 days go by without the Torah being read publicly in the community. So I guess we're fairly confident that we will in fact be able to return to Torah.
Even during the pandemic?
Even during the pandemic, yes. Now note as well, we added a couple of non-biblical verses right in the middle. So we said, Kuma Adonai lemnuchatecha. Remember we had maybe that is maybe alluding to the other Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu ovecha, right? Rise up, O Lord, and scatter your enemies. We said that, I think, at the beginning of the Torah service. Right, that was right after, right? So that's from that actually is in the Numbers passage. But here we're saying, rise up, Adonai, limenuchatecha, to your resting place. Ata v'aron uzecha, you and your mighty ark, or you and the ark of your might. And now we refer to the priests, May your priests wear righteousness and your faithful rejoice. And then we talk about David, your servant, right? What is this doing here? What does this have to do with the Torah service? Well, these are kind of some standard themes that we've seen repeated lots of times in our service. So, and there we have kind of our assortment of lines that we use to put the Torah away. And we're done with the Torah service.
That was fast.
Well, it's only taken us 11 weeks. So. Any comments or questions?
When did this composition emerge? Because someone had to put all this together and write the non-biblical verses.
Yeah, well, it's hard to know. We looked at earlier at Masechet Sofrim. So that's kind of 8th or 9th century text, which had really the first Torah service liturgy that we know about. And we saw that it was composed of, on a whole assortment of biblical verses, many of which make up various parts of our Torah service. We saw that there were some blessings that occurred after the Haftarah, which seem to have now become attached to the Haftarah, even though only one of the 4 blessings after the Haftarah seems to have anything to do with the Haftarah, but that the person who led services would just kind of continue on with these blessings. So really, it's been a gradual process. I don't know when this particular piece was incorporated, but it certainly makes a good conclusion when we consider how we started a Torah service. Right, we're concluding on similar things that we began with. So I'm not sure I can answer much more than that, but if I were to guess, I'd say a little over 1,000 years.
Would you has the Torah service changed for Sinai in the years that Sinai has existed, or since you started? Is it still the same? Has anything changed? And not just the Torah service, but the whole Siddur.
Well, we are using the same Siddur that we used when I got here.
Okay.
So there is that. There's a couple of prayers that we don't do very often. I'll point out one that we didn't spend time with, but if you look on page 151, there's a prayer there called Av Harachamim.
Yeah.
It says a memorial prayer for martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a prayer that entered into the Siddur in Ashkenaz in the wake of the Crusades. So after kind of some communities in central Germany were devastated by kind of rampaging mobs, the tradition of, there were a number of mourning traditions that arose. First of all, those who were killed were considered to be martyrs. This prayer, the Av Harachamim, and actually the one in Sim Shalom is a bit modified from what you would find in an Orthodox Siddur. But it calls to remember the martyrs for good, and then also calls on God to shmeist all of our enemies.
We acknowledge that at Yom Kippur for sure.
And that's different. That's Eila Ezkara. That's the Martyrology.
Mm.
That which when did the Martyrology start? I mean, the Martyrology traditionally didn't mention those who were killed in the Crusades. It referred to the traditional Martyrology refers to the 10 rabbis who were killed by the Romans. But so the Yizkor service also emerged in the wake of the Crusades. And so actually traditionally the Yizkor service is not in the Sephardi liturgy at all. Although there are, I think there are Sephardi communities that have adopted it.
Regarding the question if our services have changed, right when we combined the two minyanim, right before we hired Rabbi, we were using the Birnbaum Siddur. And so then when we switched to the Sim Shalom, we still did some page flipping and added in the extra, the second, come on, what is it called? For the Mourner's Kaddish. So we used to, yeah, the Mourner's Kaddish, we had a second Mourner's Kaddish at the end of services
Okay, yeah,
with a psalm or something in between.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought we do. No,
No, that comes later on in the Siddur. So the end of the service, so we do Aleinu, and then we do the Martyrs Kaddish. So you'll see often in an Orthodox service, they'll do the Aleinu, Martyrs Kaddish, then they'll do the Psalm for the Shabbat, and then another Martyrs Kaddish. So you'll have two Martyrs Kaddishes at the end of the service. So
Yeah, we did that. That's how we did the services as a part of first combining the minyanim. And the deal was at the time that we would keep the same liturgy, but women could do anything that they, wanted to do.
yeah, there were a couple other, I guess I'm remembering, there were a couple of other small elements that I cut in the interests of streamlining and shortening our service a little bit. Things that really are, let's say, not essential to, not considered to be required, not as essential to the service. Things that really wouldn't kind of take away anything that was of core importance to the service. So, the idea of adding on extra Kaddishes at the end came from a time when the mourners were saying Kaddish independently. And so a different Kaddish would be an opportunity for a different mourner to lead the Kaddish. But that's not really what happens in our service. The mourners recite the Kaddish together. So I don't know, it seemed unnecessary to add extra Kaddishes at the end of the service. So
You also improved how we did the good news and the names of the ill. You made it make more sense with the song.
I split up the Debbie Friedman song, the Mishaberach song that we sing. I split that into two parts, for the sharing gratitude and for the Mishaberach L'cholim. Yeah, I did that one. And what else did I do? So this one, Av Harachamim, there still is one person in the shul who likes to include this sometimes when he's davening. So, but we don't do it too often.
And then Anim Zmira, which we do on festivals, but not on Shabbat. Where did that?
Yeah, that I don't know what the tradition was before I got here for Anim Zmirot. I think or if there was one. I mean,
I don't remember it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I brought it, Anim Zmirot in, or there were, I don't remember. I don't know what existed before me. I know that I like Anim Zmirot. So.
all right.
I'd like to, oh, sorry.
No, I'm done.
Oh, thank you. Then returning to the Torah scroll thing, I just was thinking about it, that we walk a tension between venerating something and worshiping it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this everything that we wrap around the Torah's service is very close to, I'm going to say idolatry in the broadest sense, but of just having something that we're worshiping.
Mm-hmm.
And it hadn't occurred to me ever until today, just looking at the text and thinking about the ark in the desert and so on. It's a real line, especially, how you said all of that majesty, all the verbs that this is the king, the court and so on. That gets very close to venerating it.
So coming back to the Nehushtan, and then the copper serpent that Moses made. So that was deposited in the ark. And then during King Hezekiah's reign, they destroyed it because people had started worshiping it.
Interesting.
How'd they worship if it was in the ark?
I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of detail. Maybe they were reciting prayers to
It
it.
ate its way out, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, and back to the structure of the service, Rabbi, you do the drash or the sermon in the Torah service, which I think is really nice that it connects it to the previous learnings. In the synagogue where I grew up, and the sermon happened after the Torah was put away.
Yeah. So those are different traditions. I played around with it for a while about where the sermon would go. And I ultimately decided to put it right after Ashrei, because it felt to me like the high point of the service, like the emotional high point of the service, is when we put the Torah back in the ark and sing Eitz Chaim Hi.
That's a good point.
Like I think, you've got the ark open. People are, it's the most glorious, song, I think probably in the whole service. So it seemed to me that we want to go straight from Eitz Chaim Hi into Musaf, and to go through all that, to like reach this kind of emotional high and then make people sit and listen for 10 to 15 minutes, seems to be ruining the feeling.
Totally. Yeah.
So
That makes a lot of sense.
It
yeah,
does.
so I experiment with a few different places, and ultimately I kind of found that and liked that the best. And so there's a couple other things that we did after Joey Weisenberg came a few years ago. We started, and maybe even before, no, I think we started inviting people to come up to the bima to sing Eitz Chaim Hi. And so anybody who wanted could come up to the bima to kind of, enhance that feeling, that kind of glorious feeling, and give people another, an opportunity to really hear each other, and to be close to the ark as we're putting it away. And I think with that last line, Hashivenu Adonai, like return us, O Lord, like if we're all standing right there, that seems to be a very powerful moment. So anyway, so that's something that we introduced as well. And then a final thing that I started doing in terms of announcing page numbers, what I would try to do is after my sermon, before we started the recessional to put the Torah away, that's when I would give the page instructions for Musaf. I say, we're gonna, page 154, and then we'll then have the Chatzi Kadisha 155, followed by the Amidah 156 and 161, so that we could go straight from singing Eitz Chaim Hi to starting the davening without needing to have any interruptions in between.
And you expect people to remember those page numbers?
I hope. I mean, the advantage is it all just goes straight in order. So if you just keep turning pages, you'll be all right.
I also
The other thing you have to listen for is remembering to do the festival Amidah once in a while.
Yeah, that one, yeah.
I also like I don't know if you've done this recently or if you've been doing it all along, and I only noticed it recently, but when you talk about the Amidah, but like a paragraph before, so we don't interrupt the transition.
Yeah, and actually I made more of a focus on doing that because of this class, actually. Right, so that's, if you remember back in Shachari, there's a couple of places where we're explicitly supposed to connect either the word, one word from one prayer to the immediately following word, or a theme. So like we're supposed to somech geula l'tfila. We're supposed to connect redemption to the Amidah. So that final prayer, Ga'al Yisrael, that comes right before the Amidah, there's not supposed to be an interruption between that and the beginning of the Amidah. So to say Ga'al Yisrael and then to start giving page instructions, kind of an interruption.
And also, isn't that why the Orthodox stand up earlier than we tend to, because they don't want to interrupt with their standing up?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, Akuma, Sur Yisrael is when I see most people standing up.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, in an Orthodox synagogue, you would tend to not have page announcements at all. Right,
But there's also some Kaddishes, like I don't know if it's the half Kaddish or whatever, but that where the Orthodox stand for it and we sit for it. And for the first paragraph of the
It's
Torah
not an
service-
Orthodox, non-Orthodox thing.
Is it?
There's different traditions in different places.
Okay.
There are no rules for the Kaddish.
And then the first
standing.
paragraph of the Torah service, we sit down. And I've seen other people in other congregations stand up.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, well, at an Orthodox one, but I don't know if that has anything to do
So at the
with,
very beginning at Ein Kamocha? I don't know if
Yeah.
I've seen that. Yeah.
they're standing for that already.
All right, let's move on. We have Musaf. Oops. All right. Okay, Musaf. Musaf means additional. But before we can understand what it's additional, we have to understand what it is additional to. So this is from Numbers chapter 28, verses 1 to 8. This is Parshat Pinchas, towards the end of Numbers. And this introduces one of the calendars that appears in the Torah. And this one is really focused on the sacrifices. Exactly which sacrifices, how many of them for each of the holidays. So the chapter begins with this. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, command the Israelite people and say to them, be punctilious, good word, in presenting to me at stated times the offerings of food due me as offerings by fire of pleasing odor to me. Say to them, these are the offerings by fire that you are to present to the Lord as a regular burnt offering every day. 2 yearling lambs without blemish. You shall offer 1 lamb in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. And as a meal offering, there shall be 1/10 of an ephah of choice flour, etc., etc., etc. We get to the end. We get a libation, another lamb at twilight. And that's an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. So this right here, I'm going to point out, where was it? All right, well, this is the Tamid offering, the daily offering. So every day of the year, 355 or 354 or 365, however you want to, whatever year you want to count, this sacrifice has to be offered on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur, on Tuesday, every day of the year. This is the daily offering. So this introduces the calendar of sacred offerings. And then we start to hear
takes
about—
care of the lamb population. That really takes care of the lamb population.
Oh, yeah. All right, then we get to the next verse. Uv Yom HaShabbat, and on the Sabbath day, 2 yearling lambs without blemish, together with 2/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in as a meal offering, and with the proper libation. And then it says, Olat Shabbat b'Shabbato, al Olat HaTamid v'Niska. So a burnt offering for Shabbat b'Shabbato, each and every Sabbath, every single Sabbath, we have to offer this burnt offering, al Olat HaTamid v'Niska, in addition to the Tamid burnt offering, the regular burnt offering, v'Niska, and its libation, right? So what we saw on the previous page, that was the Tamid offering. Every single day we get a burnt offering, and then we also get a libation that goes along with it. And so this is supplemental to that. This is the Musaf to that. So we can see that, in temple times, there was an extra offering that occurred on Shabbat. And then the chapters 28 and 29 just continue going through all of the various holidays of the year, describing the extra sacrifice that would be brought on those particular offerings. The chapters that follow, or the passages that follow, are the Maftir readings on each of the festivals, right? So that final reading is always from Numbers chapters 28 or 29. It's from the Pinchas calendar, and it describes the special sacrifice that is offered. And so that's true of the 3 harvest festivals. It's true Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Rosh Chodesh. They all get the selection from Numbers that describes the extra sacrifices that are brought in those days.
Yes. So if you have a few kosher Torah scrolls, you typically keep one rolled to Pinchas.
We keep one rolled to Pinchas, right? So right now in our ark, there is a scroll already rolled to Pinchas, right? Ready to go, ready for the next holiday. Okay, all right, is that, any questions? All right, so we've introduced the idea of something extra on Shabbat. All right, but is that in fact where the Musaf Amidah comes from? That's a question. So we're going to go back to Second Temple times, and we have an institution called the Ma'amadot and the Mishmarot. So the Ma'amad is like a watch, like a standing, like you're standing in position, right? So that, and then the Mishmar, that's like the guardianship or something like that. 2 different words for watches. One of them refers to the non-priestly watches, and the other refers to the priestly watches. So now we're going to read what this is talking about. So this is from Mishnah, the Mishnah in Ta'anit. Ta'anit's the tractate that deals with all the laws about fasts, public fasts. And we've seen other passages from Ta'anit before, because there is a lot of material there that pertains to tefillah, as we know. So Elu hein ma'amadot. These are the ma'amadot. And so the ma'amadot are the non-priestly watches. All right, now why do we need priestly watches or non-priestly watches? Lafi shene'amar, because it says, and by the way, we just read this from the passage describing the Tamid offering 2 slides ago. So as it says, command the children of Israel and say to them, my offering of food, which is presented to me, made by a fire of a sweet savor to me, you shall guard the sacrifice to me in its due season. Okay, so who is being addressed in this verse?
Moses.
All right, so it's Moses giving the command to Bnei Israel, to the children of Israel. Who is not being directly addressed are the priests, right? So here we have the children of Israel, like the Jewish people collectively, being instructed to offer these sacrifices on a regular basis. So that's what the Mishnah is dealing with here. So now we ask the question, Heach korbano shel adam karev hu eino omed al gabav. How can a person's offering be sacrificed when that person is not standing next to it? All right, we've got a problem. If all of Israel is commanded to offer all these sacrifices every single day of the year, it's just not practical, not going to work. So how are the Jewish people supposed to observe this commandment? So answer, the early prophets, by which the Mishnah assumes we're talking about Samuel and David, instituted 24 mishmarot, 24 priestly watches. For each and every priestly watch, there was a corresponding non-priestly watch, a ma'amad. In Jerusalem, a non-priestly watch in Jerusalem of priests, Levites, and Israelites. When the time arrived for a priestly watch to ascend, the priests and Levites of that watch would ascend to Jerusalem. And as for the Israelites of that priestly watch, assembled in their towns and read the act of creation. Okay, so let's see if we can unpack this. We've got this idea of 24 different watches, different groups of people scattered throughout the land of Israel. We've got a problem, right? The priests are all commanded to officiate in the temple, but there are a lot of priests, thousands and thousands of priests. There's just simply not enough space for all of these priests to to offer all these sacrifices all day long. So they did a practical thing, and they divided all the priests and Levites up into 24 separate watches. Right? It was kind of divided up by family or clan, and each watch would serve for 1 week at a time. And so over the course of a year, they would end up serving twice. So, and we saw this, by the way, when we looked at the Mishnah that was describing kind of the earliest prayers that eventually seemed to form our Shacharit service, was that there was on Musaf, the incoming watch and the outgoing watch they'd kind of have an exchange. And one of them would say a prayer for, I forget which one. One of them said a prayer for the other one. Right. So we saw that other reference to it as well. So here we have it being described a little bit. And so, all right. So if you are an Israelite, you are connected to one of the mishmarot. You're part of a ma'amad that is connected to a mishmar. It's a little bit ambiguous from this Mishnah, but it seems that some Israelites would actually go up with their cohort to Jerusalem to be part of it, but probably most would stay back wherever it is that they lived. But that doesn't mean they didn't have a job to do. So back in their own village or town or wherever it is they left, at the same time of day when the priests and the Levites would be officiating in the temple for that particular sacrifice, the Israelites back in their hometown would be reciting some sort of prayer, right? And here we can see the Mishnah says they're korin b'maasev reshit. They'd be reading of the work of creation. So, the opening chapter of Genesis. And so it seems that was maybe for each day of the week, they would read the corresponding day for that. And that seems to have been an early stratum of public prayer that took place. Now, it's not everybody doing it every day of the week, but when it was your ma'amad, your job was to recite the corresponding verses at the appropriate time as a liturgy. And it seems that they were doing that as well during the Musaf service, right? So during that Musaf offering, they also would have things that they would have to recite to correspond. And so we can see this as really an aspect of public prayer that, notice it predates the destruction of the temple, right? So kind of the standard story that we tell is that the Amidah is a replacement for the sacrifices that used to be offered in the temple, right? We saw, as we were reading about the daily offering, there's a morning sacrifice and there's offered at twilight. That's the mincha sacrifice. So shacharit and mincha, those are replacements for the sacrifices that took place. But here we seem to be suggesting that while the temple still stood and the sacrifices were still being offered, there was public liturgy that was taking place. So maybe the origins of the Amidah extend a little bit older than we initially assumed. So unfortunately, we don't have a Siddur dating from 67 BCE that would answer all of our questions about this.
Yeah, actually, so I had a question because for Musaf, there's this whole there's that section you just showed us that talks about the sacrifice for Musaf.
Yeah.
But how come we don't have a similar, unless I just don't remember, how come we don't have a similar blurb for the regular, I guess, is it the Shabbat or just the daily sacrifice that the Shacharit Amidah is supposed to replace?
Okay, so just to clarify the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, during the weekday Amidah or during the Shacharit on Shabbat Amidah, we do not read about any sacrifices.
From what I remember, yeah.
Yeah, you're correct. We don't. Yeah. So what we think back to the origins of the Amidah, we saw that there was some sort of Amidah type thing that was taking place before the temple was destroyed, but it wasn't until the decade after the temple was destroyed that the rabbis fixed the themes for the Amidah, and it wasn't for several centuries before the language to deal with those themes became affixed. So if we're talking about, pre-destruction, there's something going on there. There's some sort of prayer that's being recited, but probably there's nothing that's so fixed that we'd be publishing it in a Siddur by that point. So, and I think also that the question of, was this in fact something that was introduced as a replacement for the sacrifices? That theory is also questionable. So it's we have a lot of questions. We don't have clear answers. And because by the time that the rabbis of the Mishnah or especially the Talmud are getting it, they don't themselves necessarily know how these things came into existence.
But then why do we then have that specific reading about sacrifices for Musaf? If that wouldn't you
because
need it
the
for
story about Musaf being a substitution for the now non-existent sacrificial system, I mean, that's the story that we tell. So it would make perfect sense to then read about what those sacrifices were in the Musaf service, in the Musaf Amidah.
Yeah, I just thought we would do it for both, since they both, if our story that we tell is that each Amidah is for one of the sacrifices, you would think that before each Amidah, there'd be a discussion of the sacrifice it's replacing. Whenever that became
one might think that. Yeah, but we don't do that. So, all right, let's still on Ma'amadot and Mishmarot. All right, so now this is Tractate Brachot, chapter 4, Mishnah 7. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Ein tfilata musafin ella b'chever ir. The additional prayer, right? So this is the extra Musaf. The extra Musaf Amidah is only recited in a city where there is a chever ir. So chever may be like a chevra, like an association. Ir could be city or town. Not totally clear what this chever ir is referring to. Yeah. Chachamim omrim bechever ir v'shelo bechever ir. So the sages say, yes, when there's a chever ir, but also when there's not a chever ir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishmo. So Rabbi Yehuda says, in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's names, Kol makom sheyesh chever ir, hayachid patur mitfilat musafin. In any place where there is a chever ir, the individual is exempt from reciting tfilat musaf, right? From reciting the additional prayer. All right, so we got three different statements here.
So Rabbi Yehuda thinks that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said exactly the opposite of what he's reported as saying a few verses before.
Yeah, it's a qualification of it, right? So we got Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah coming along and saying Musaf is only said when there's a chever ir. So what is a chever ir? We don't exactly know, but presumably it means that you've got people in the community coming together. Maybe it's a minyan. We've got, you have at least 10 people coming together to recite Musaf. It's quite possible that this is a vestige of the Ma'amadot and Mishmarot system, right? So you had, remember, you had people when these sacrifices were being offered, when it was your week, gathering together in the city to recite some sort of prayer to accompany the sacrifice that was being offered in Jerusalem. So if the chever ir is connected to that system of ma'amadot and mishmarot, then that's kind of interesting, because then we have an association of musaf here as only being done, in those contexts, and it's not something for individual Jews to do on their own, right? There's no obligation whatsoever for the individual Jew to daven musaf. That's what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying. Now the rabbis say, no, doesn't matter. If you got a minyan or no minyan, or chever ir or no chever ir, everybody has to daven musaf, right? So it seems possible, at least, that the rabbis either are changing the practice, are trying to expand a tradition, or they don't actually know about the tradition that had existed earlier. And then we have Rabbi Yehuda kind of looking for some sort of middle ground, right? So if there's a Chever Ir in your town, then if you're by yourself, you don't have to daven it, right? And I guess that means that if there's no Chever Ir in your town, you do have to. So the obligation is that the Musaf has to be davened, but not necessarily by you, the individual. That's what Rabbi Yehuda seems to be suggesting here. All right, so, but we're still left with a mystery. It's not totally clear what a Chever Ir is a reference to. All right. In any event, we have a Tfilat Musafin, which is now, under Jewish law considered to be obligatory. We follow the Chachamim as they appear in this Mishnah. Everybody's got to say Musaf, and at least part of the language of the Musaf Amidah makes explicit reference to the Musaf sacrifices and the sacrificial system collectively. All right, so we're going to go straight to the Kedusha, because the first page of the Amidah is identical, right? So the first page is on 156A or 156B. That was exactly the same as what we saw for Shacharit. For the Kedusha, the language is different. Okay. Musically, it's also different. All right. So just give an example here. You can put a finger on 157 and then put another finger back on 116. And in fact, we can go even back one page to the final blessing before the Kedusha, right? So that's where it says V'ne'eman. So V'ne'eman ata l'chayot meitim, Baruch atah Hashem. What comes next?
Mechayeh hamatim.
Mechayeh hametim, but how do I sing it? Okay, that's the Musaf version of it, all right? So when I get to Musaf, Baruch atah Hashem mechayeh hametim. All right, that's very big and grand.
Yes.
All right, for Shabbat, I did not do that, or at least I wasn't supposed to do that. Baruch atah Hashem mechayeh hametim. Right?
Yes.
And so what is the difference? The difference is that for the Shacharit version, I stayed in the same mode that I was in before, right?
Yeah.
I'm sticking with the mode for Shabbat Shacharit, the musical mode. But for Musaf, I need to get big and grand. And so that Mechayeh hametim, it's switching from, roughly speaking, it's switching from minor to major.
And that's in preparation for the Kedusha?
And that is in preparation for the Kedusha, right? So looking back for the Shacharit, Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam keshem shemakdishim oto b'shmei marom kakatu al yad nevi'echa v'karazel zeh ve'amar kadosh karararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararararar when we get to 157, for Musaf.
Okay.
Mechaye hametim. We got
Okay.
a few melodies we could pick from, but Naritzecha v'nakdishecha kesod siach sarfei kodesh. Right? It's upbeat. It's more joyous. It's more major, and that is the mode for Musaf. And by the way, it's similar to the mode that we had during much of the Torah service as well, which kind of has its origins in high holiday liturgy. But no, it's grand. And that's appropriate because this is the extra service for the special holy day that we are celebrating.
And what was the reason again, we can't do Kadisha unless we have a minyan?
Because it's a public proclamation of the holiness of God's name. Right? So it's Devarim Shebikdusha. So words that are in holiness, right? You know, public proclamations of God, of the holiness of God's name, those have to be done with a minyan. So, all right, and it extends. So, Hamakdishim Shimcha B'Kodesh Kakatuv Al Yad Nevi'echa Bekarazeh Ve'amar. And the congregation, right? If the person leading it has done their job correctly, then the congregation will automatically sing the right tune for Kadosh, 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 right? Which will be Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzevaot Melech Haaretz Kevodo. Right? That should sound familiar. Now, if the Shaliach Tzibor has not done their job correctly, then the congregation will sing Kadosh, 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 I don't know if you can hear the difference, Sherry. I can tell you can hear the difference. But the second version, that's the version for Shacharit. It's a more minor kind of sound to it. But the beautiful thing is that the person leading, a cantor or somebody who knows Nusach will, by the way that they lead service, they're able to cue the congregation to sing the correct tune in the correct mode, whether or not the congregation has any musical training at all.
See, I would switch it. I would do Shacharit in a more major and switch to minor, only insofar as you're waking up still. Well, at least I am. But you need something a little more punchy as you start your davening. That's where I'm coming from. But
I hear you. So I am going to guess that just about every one of the melodies that may be bouncing around in your head for any of these prayers on 157 are in a major key, right? So Kavodo. Kavodo Maleolam, Kavodo Maleolam, Kavodo, right? Very, it's a very happy kind of melody. Now, if we sing it, if we do this instead, Kevodo Maleolam, right? So that was not composed as a melody for Musaf. That's Erev Shel Shoshanim, right? Popular Israeli folk song. And it is in the wrong mode. It is not in, it's not major, definitely minor. But it's a beautiful melody. And so there's always this balance between kind of doing things technically correct, following the exact musical traditions versus doing things that are beautiful and engage with the congregation and help people connect to the prayers.
do congregants usually check with you first before they introduce a melody that hasn't been used before when they're leading? Or
not usually.
Okay.
Not usually. But the truth is, though, most of our daveners are, somewhat regular daveners, and it's not too often that somebody introduces a melody that has never been heard before in the synagogue.
Okay, and the William Tell Overture was okay with you?
Is it okay with me? I mean, it's a beautiful melody. I don't know if beautiful is the right word for it, but it's, I wouldn't put it to it. I mean, I don't like it on its own alone.
I know, I don't either. Yeah.
But, okay,
Rabbi?
so.
Rabbi?
So, yeah.
Wasn't there it seems like our daveners now, like you've educated them on proper nusach and all that.
We've made progress, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, not as much in the last few years, but I, definitely spent a lot of time trying to standardize some of our davening and some of our music to make it easier for the congregation to sing along.
Oh, and what's the vahu thing? Like, where does that, how does that fit in Musaf wise?
Okay, all right, so let's keep going on. All right, so I kind of laid it out on the screen, but you can also see it in your Siddur. There's kind of a call and response between the Shaliach Tzibur and the congregation. So the congregation's parts are definitely those bold parts that are indented, similar to what we saw in the Shacharit service. But in Musaf, it's a little bit more extensive, right? We've got a longer Kedusha. You can see just in terms of the congregational parts, we added a Shema Yisrael line, and we added Ani Adonai Elohechem. Those were not in Shacharit. And the Shaliach Tzibur's parts, which are in between those bold parts, there's a few more of them, and they're different than what we saw in Shacharit. Now, they cover very similar themes, and we'll look at it in more detail next week. They're still talking about the angels, and that we're using the words that the angels use when the angels just sing praises to God. But it's Musaf, so we're making it a little bit grander. It's fancier than what we do in Shacharit. But musically, by the time we get to the end of the Kedusha, the tradition is to bring the nusach back to the same nusach that we used in Shacharit. Right. So at some point after Na'aritzcha, before Lador Vador, things switch back. So by the time we get to, usually I think the switch happens around the Shema Yisrael line. But definitely when we get to Yimloch, we're back into Yimloch, hallelujah, right? And that was the same more minor type of sound that we had during Shacharit. But for the Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh and Baruch Kevod, the first two, those would be in major. So we heard the Kadosh, 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 and then Baruch Kevod Adonai Mehi Mekomo, also very, very major, more upbeat. So we start off in that major mode, and then by the end are back into the more minor mode. Now, cantors will, for a cantor, the repetition of the Musaf Amida, this is like their time to shine. And so kind of in the golden age of cantorial arts, they would go on and on and on with Musaf, these big elaborate melodies. And part of the challenge that the cantors would set for themselves is I'm going to go on wild musical adventures over the course of the repetition, but by the end of the Amidah, I will have brought it back down to where it's supposed to be nusach-wise. So this is what cantors were doing in the mid 20th century.
So when cantors do that, they're usually doing it solo, right? They're not engaging the congregation as well.
Oh yeah, solo or like with choirs and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah, but that has become less popular in recent decades.
So you said it's a call and response, but it's a call and response where the congregation leads and then the supposed leader repeats after the congregation.
Well, maybe there are different traditions about who is supposed to say what when. So, and I'm not sure that there are hard and fast rules. Other than the congregation has to say all the bold sentences, and the leader has to say all of the other sentences. So, but yeah, often you'll have the congregation doing the other parts as well.
Do they ever do it together as opposed to call and response? Just do it together?
Yeah, so like what we would have is all right, so we sing Naritzcha, and then after V'karazel Amar, and the congregation does their Kadosh, 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 and then the congregation continues silently. And then the Shaliach Tzibur then repeats that line, both of those lines after the.
I was wondering about that, why there's a long delay before the Shili.
Yeah,
whatever
so
you
it's to
call it.
give congregants a chance to recite it to themselves. And
Okay.
is it necessary? Is it not? I don't know.
But I also think about the Nusach, because when you do Kavodo Male Olam, it's very major, right? But then when you get to Mim Komo Hu Yifan, that usually tends to sound very minor.
Well, because we often will sing Erev Shal Shoshanim to it.
Oh, okay.
But try this. Baruch Yoram Mimikomo, then Mimikomo Hu Yifen Berachamim Ve'achonam Yachadim Shemo Erev V'choyom Tamid Hamayim Yava Shema Omrim.
Very different.
Something like that.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, any of the more traditional melodies composed specifically for this are going to put it in major.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay.
All right, so well, this is a good place to stop. We'll go into the meaning of all of this next week.